Donators, in turn, became large feudal lords. The formation of the culture of the knights is directly linked with the feudal system. The classic symbol of the Middle Ages is considered a knight in armor and a weapon in his hands. This is due to the fact that knights often became feudal lords through loyal service to the monarch, who subsequently endowed them with land and money. After all, medieval knights were first and foremost professional warriors. Knights of noble lineage were at the head of their vigilantes or armies. War in the Middle Ages was a privilege of the upper class, which received for their service not only land, but also entire villages and towns. The tradition of chivalry was extended throughout Europe. A true medieval knight, especially a knight in medieval Spain, had to come from a noble family of knights and know his pedigree to at least the 5th tribe. The family coat of arms and motto served as proof of the noble origin of the knights. The title of knights was inherited or given by the king for military exploits. The emergence of the knights' estates emerged in the 8th century with the Franks, when there was a transition from people's militia on foot to the vessel horse army. But it would have been simple, but under the law of succession, the title, castle, and lands were inherited only by the eldest son. And if there were more sons, the middle son usually went to the clergy, and the youngest, like in the fairy tale, remained the cat in boots. All they had was a noble name. Crowds of noble but penniless men, the knights, roaming Europe in search of service, long fueled internecine wars until the church came up with a new pastime, the Crusades. Under the influence of the church, the medieval cavalry became an elite military class that served high ideals. The era of the Crusades finally turned the medieval knight into a role model. The Crusades, which stretched over the centuries, united the knightly class. The feudal lord, who had only rarely met his neighbors before, now began to feel like a member of a single brotherhood. The Crusades strengthened the Vara and helped the church gain wealthy sponsors. We have already seen sculptures of donors of the entrances and coats of arms on the capitals. Very often, a church built with sponsor money also became a family vault. In front of us are exhibits from the tomb of the Earl of Urquell family. Ermengarde X, Count of Urquell, financed the reconstruction of the monastery church in Avellana in the Gothic style. He arranged a family tomb in the church. It is said that this ensemble of tombs was created to house the remains of Ermengarde VII, who died in 1184, and is considered the founder of the present monastery. The family tomb also includes the double tomb of Don Alvar Rodrigo de Cabrera, Count of Urgell, and his wife Cecilia de Fox, c. 1300 to 1350. The documentary evidence suggests that this ensemble of tombstones was created for Alvar Rodrigo de Cabrera and his wife Cecilia de Foix, parents of Ermengarde X. The monastery of Belpuig de la Avelin was abandoned and badly damaged during the Wars of Succession, which began around 1700. Tomb image of a boy, probably Ermengarde IX, Count of Urgell. First half of the 14th century, the coat of arms of the Earls of Urgell on the shoulder strap of the boy's image suggests that it represents Ermengarde IX, the uncle of Ermengarde X, and the only Earl of Urgell who died as a boy. Because the tomb is too small for the young man's body, the sarcophagus was made many years after his death and of small form. Having arranged the graves of his ancestors, the Earl also took care of himself. Grave of Ermengarde X, Earl of Urquell, c. 1300 to 1350. In his will, Ermengarde X ordered that a fine tomb be set up in the chapel of the monastery church. The earliest surviving descriptions correspond to this image in chainmail and plate armor. He was probably a knight and may have fought in the Crusades. Another tomb in the museum's collection is that of the Knight of the Delieu family, after 1248 by 1267 France. 3 generations of men from the Alioute family went to the Holy Land to retrieve the Holy Sepulchre and redeem their souls. The pride of this knight was such that he chose to present himself as a heavily armed but prayerful warrior forever. Interestingly, his sword does not match his armor. Its shape is typical of Chinese weapons. Whether he bought it from the Holy Land market or forcibly snatched it from his opponent. Lady's female tombstone, mid-13th century, France. This image, probably depicting Margaret of Gloucester, wife of Robert II, Baron of Nieburg, is depicted in aristocratic costume of the period. On her belt hangs a purse, or almoner, with coins for the needy, a needle holder, and a sheath knife for eating. And now, let's look at what all these burials have in common. The sculptural tomb of a knight was called effigy, and it was usually made of stone or wood. The sculpture could be full-length or in the form of a bust. Most often the figure of the deceased was in a reclining or standing position, but a kneeling version is also not uncommon. Ordinary knights, dignitaries of the state, and large landowners of the time were given a place after death in the family's vault, which eventually became a family tomb. Effigies were the most common decoration of medieval tombstones. If you look closely at knightly tombstones, you can catch a connecting thread in their images, which has become a tradition. By the effigy, you can learn a lot about the life and death of a buried person. These are the features. 1. By the shape of the legs. If the legs are crossed, the knight was a member of the Crusade. If the legs look normal, it means that the deceased did not participate in military campaigns against infidels. 2. By an animal lying at his feet. A dog lies at the feet of that knight who died by his death. The living and triumphant lion was on the grave of the knight that died in the battle that brought victory to the Christians. 3. By the presence of a helmet on his head. If there is no helmet but only a weapon, the deceased was not a knight, but served in the army. The helmet denoted the knighthood of the person lying in the grave. 4. By battle armor and visor. The raised visor, spears, and sword, as well as full battle attire, were worn by that knight who was repeatedly victorious in jousts and tournaments. If the visor is removed and the sword is hidden in the scabbard, then the warrior died of wounds received in battle. Empty scabbards and lack of spurs indicates that the knight was captured during the battle and died in captivity. Often an effigy in formal attire and with state symbols was used after the death of a monarch to exhibit it to his subjects for farewell. After the proclamation of a new king or queen, the sculptural image of the deceased was moved to the royal family tomb. In the 14th century, the fashion for sculpted tombstones of knights spread throughout Western Europe. One of the key components of the Middle Ages is the cult of the Virgin Mary. There was no mention in the Bible, Tanka, of a separate role for this woman. There was simply Jesus. It is interesting that originally in the paintings of the first underground churches, Jesus is depicted as a Roman god. For a long time, he would be portrayed as a blood monk and shepherd with a lamb on his shoulders. Then, he would have both masculine and feminine features, and only after the first Christian councils would he acquire the masculine features and masculinity. The Virgin Mary would begin to symbolize the feminine side of God. Initially, as is clear from the revelations of John, the Christian Virgin Mary was represented as a nameless winged heavenly woman, clothed with sunbeams and wearing a crown of 12 stars on her head. She gave birth to her son, the anointed Christ Jesus, in torments in heaven, and was persecuted along with him by a monstrous 7-headed dragon. This early Christian myth is clearly borrowed from the religions of ancient Egypt and Syria. There is no mention of Christ's mother as an early woman in the later Christian work, the epistles of Paul. In the Gospel of Mark, too, there is no account of the Virgin Mary giving birth to Jesus Christ. In that work, Jesus as the God-man appears on earth as an adult. For the first time, the Virgin Mary gets earthly features, turns into the Virgin Mary, who, as a result of the Immaculate Conception, becomes the mother of the God-man Christ in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, written in the first half of the 2nd century. The cult of Mary began to develop first of all in the East, where they first referred to her in prayers. 3 to 4 centuries, wrote hymns in her honor, and mentioned her in the liturgy. In the 3rd and 5th centuries AD, the Christian doctrine about the Blessed Virgin Mary became more or less complete. According to this teaching, Mary played an important role in saving the world from original sin. The Church taught that if sin entered the world through the first woman, Eve, then through the Mother of God, Mary, salvation from sin also entered. For the atoning death of Jesus Christ only became possible after his earthly birth by Mary. The Council of Ephesus of the East, in 431, recognized that it was possible to call the Virgin Mary the Mother of God. Thus, the cult of the Virgin Mary merged with the basic tenets of early Christianity and took a prominent place in this new religion. The cult of Mary, Madonna, among Catholics overshadowed even the cult of Jesus Christ himself. The image of Our Lady began to take shape in the Romanesque period. We will consider several types of images characteristic of different periods of history within the museum. The first of these is the Madonna on the throne. The image of the Mother of God seated on the throne with the child on her lap and surrounded by archangels and apostles dates back to the 5th and 6th centuries. The classical proportions of the figures create a sense of solemnity. The austerity of the painting's characters is reminiscent of Christian mosaics or Byzantine icons. Every detail has a symbolic meaning. The child's attire resembles that of ancient philosophers or royal robes. The early images are very static. The figures lack dynamicism and any anatomical plausibility. The sculpture is designed for worship. Inner concentration, restraint must be conveyed to the person praying. One of the earliest examples of this type of sculpture is the Blessed Virgin and Child, 1150 to 1200, France. The strict and rhythmic lines of this sculpture are almost modern in their effect. In fact, this seemingly simple depiction of the infant Jesus sitting motionless on Our Lady's lap represents a complex medieval theological concept known as Sedis Sapientiae, Throne of Wisdom, in which Mary serves as throne for Christ, who in turn embodies divine origin, wisdom. Our Lady with Child, probably by the same artist, we have already seen in the main building of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Another type bears the title of Madonna in Glory, or Queen of Heaven. This type resembles the first in some respects, but the Madonna on the throne did not yet have the attribute of royalty in the form of a crown. In the second half of the 12th century, the tendency to give the image of the Virgin and Child the attributes of royal dignity becomes more pronounced. A striking example is the work of Spanish masters of the Blessed Virgin and Child, c. 1280 to 1300. This sculpture, in which much of the medieval decoration has been preserved, depicts the Virgin Mary as the throne of wisdom. The figures are less static. The artist tries to convey the movement of the mother and child, and due to the painting, the sculpture is very decorative and festive. The most common image is the Madonna standing with an infant in her arms. As it develops, this sculpture, as seen in the S-shaped curves of the silhouettes, the gradual conformity of bodily proportions, and the acquisition of flesh. In the Gothic tradition, the Madonna is often depicted as a court lady in fancy dress and hairstyles, and the infant as a jolly boob in his mother's arms. Less secular sculptures also occur. The Virgin with the infant on the crescent moon c. 1480, German work. Carved in high relief, this sculpture was undoubtedly the focal group in the central sanctuary of a large winged altar of the type that flourished in southern Germany and Austria during the late Gothic period. The image of the Virgin Mary on the crescent reflects St. John's vision, Apocalypse 12:1, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet. The ball held by Christ signifies his role as spiritual ruler of the world, and the grapes in his mother's hand symbolize the wine of the Mass. Another subject in art, the mourning of Christ since the 13th century in Italy. The word Pietà refers to the scene of the Virgin Mary mourning Christ. The Pietà is a dialogue between the mother and the son, and the main type of Pietà composition is the image of Mary sitting and holding Jesus on her lap. There are very different accents in the depiction of Mary mourning Jesus. In the early compositions, very often the emphasis is on the suffering appearance of Christ. In his dead body, the traces of suffering must be felt. The curved rib cage, the protruding ribs, the wounds, the pointed face, the deepened experience of death. This is the image of the German master that we see in the museum. Pietà, Vesperbild, 1375 to 1400. The body of Christ, frozen in death, bears the traces of his passion. Its small scale may reflect the writings of German mystics who believed that the Virgin, in the agony of her grief, imagined holding Christ in her arms again as an infant. By the 15th century, the emphasis changes. We notice a paradoxical thing. First, that the emphasis here is not only on the appearance of the dead Christ, but on the striking beauty of Mary's appearance. Mary is young, very young. Her grief, for all its depth, is very restrained, and the appearance has some amazing high degree of aesthetics. Pietà, c. 1400, Bohemia. The Christian writings do not mention the moment when Jesus' mother held his dead body in her lap. Nevertheless, in the hands of the theologians and later artists, this imagery moment became the focus of prayer and reflection. Here, the sculpture contrasts the emaciated, almost naked body of Jesus with the large, enveloping garment of Mary, who squeezes his thin wrist as if checking his pulse. The poignancy of the sculpture transcends Christianity, touching at the heart of the mother's love for her son and the tragedy of his early death. Religious images emphasizing the physical suffering of Christ appeared in the early 14th century. This example, derived from the Bohemian type known as the Vesperbild, or Virgin of Sorrow, belongs to this tradition. Early examples depict the Virgin in a state of great excitement, but by the 15th century, her demeanor becomes more calm and contemplative. The lyrical naturalism of the figure marks the beginning of German late Gothic, Pietà, 1435 to 40, German. Directly related to the cult of the Virgin Mary is the mystical character, the unicorn. In the Middle Ages, the unicorn was known in European folklore as a small but fierce creature, which was a symbol of the virginity and reincarnation of Jesus Christ, and only an innocent girl could tame it. While the existence of unicorns was discredited by the end of the 16th century, the animal had time to firmly establish itself in the cultural consciousness of the people. The symbol of the Cloisters Museum is a gobelin with a depiction of a unicorn. Gobelin is a kind of a wall-less rug with a plait or ornamental composition. This rug was woven by hand from colored or silk threads by means of their cross-weaving. The word tapestry itself originated as early as the 17th century in France, and is nothing more than the use of the name of the Tapestry brothers to refer to the name of wall carpets.